Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Demographica UK. My name's Jack Street. I'm joined, as always, by Brett Lee, and our guest today, the former SNP MP for North East Fife and current Professor of Practice in International Relations at the University of St Andrews, Stephen Gethins. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
No problem. Thanks for having me along today.
No, you're welcome. So we wanted to, first of all, discuss with you Russia and
Yeah,
democratization in Russia. Obviously, this has
yeah,
been an area of focus because of the arrest of the opposition politician Alexei
yeah,
Navalny, who was poisoned, fled the country, spent some time in Germany, and recently returned.
yeah.
This hasn't been an isolated case of opposition in the region.
Not at
Different
all.
kinds of protests. What are some of your sort of brief views on the first of all the arrest of Alexei Navalny, but also the unrest in Russia in different areas?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'll say is we should never forget is Russia is a wonderful country, with which we have close links. You know, in Scotland, the rest of the UK, and the rest of across Europe as well. It's an important neighbour. Its culture, its education system, its traditions, and the people themselves are fantastic. And it always makes me think that they deserve so much better than they have in their current government, and they deserve so much better than sometimes the attention that they're given. I'll give you one reflection. You know, when people sometimes try and think, "Oh, this is just a domestic situation," it's not. It's something we should all care about. Um, Russia is a dangerous place to be a journalist. Russia is a dangerous place to be an opposition politician. Russia is a dangerous place to criticize the government in its interests. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. I also, just as a personal reflection, I, I remember going to Russia, and one of the most striking things that I did, and some of the bravest people I've met, were to meet some of those opposition activists. Now, Alexei Navalny, extraordinarily brave, you know, to go to Germany because you have been poisoned and then return to almost certain arrest, and other damage is an extraordinarily brave thing to do. But I'd like, and I'm sure, I don't know Alexei Navalny, but I'm sure he wouldn't mind me touching upon some of the individuals who are brave that maybe go under the radar. And I can remember having meetings over in Russia on the Foreign Affairs Committee with a group of MPs. We had to meet with a group of human rights activists privately because they could, you know, so they weren't tracked on their way to meet us, so we could be briefed direct. And it was so striking because you were meeting LGBT activists who still bore the scars of police beatings. You were meeting lawyers who were struggling for work because they were campaigning for the rule of law, not a change of law, just for the rule of law so that rules were adhered to. But I found the most powerful group that I ever met with was the group Mothers of Russia. And all they were campaigning for was the right to have information about their sons and daughters, their kids, often teenagers, who'd been sent off to fight in Putin's wars, be it in Ukraine, in Syria, or elsewhere. And they did not have the very simple information about their children. And I found that really powerful because their message was a very, very, very simple one. They were, as parents would be anywhere in the world, concerned about their children going off to war. They incidentally weren't arguing about the rights or wrongs of the war, just simply the rights to know what had happened to their children. And they were getting police harassment for for doing so. So it's the ordinary Russians that I think we sometimes get lost in this story, where the media necessarily focus in on Navalny as they rightly should, as a sort of figurehead for the opposition movement.
Yeah. Do you think that these movements, of course, there are plenty of groups like you highlight that have been involved in calling for not even necessarily full systemic change in Russia, but just these fundamental rights. Do you think that this discontent that has been highlighted with Alexei Navalny's case is indicative of something larger that's happening in Russia at the moment? Or do you think that there have been these flare-ups traditionally, and we won't necessarily see that change anytime soon?
To think so, when you meet an awful lot of these activists, They are thoughtful, um, and Russia has such a rich tradition of it can have a rich tradition of debate and discussion. So I would hope that we're tapping into something, and that there is that movement. It certainly seems to be so. I mean, if you look at the campaigning that's taken place across umpteen time zones, Russia is vast. It's a big country, but you're seeing these demonstrations popping up all over Russia. So yes, I do think there's something there. I think that people in Russia deserve our support, and this is where I'd encourage anybody to read the Foreign Affairs Committee report that came out in it was 2017, 2018 on Russian gold, on the areas where the UK could actually be doing an awful lot more to counter corruption in Russia by greater implementation of the Magnitsky regulations, and also looking at where money's come from. I mean, if you look at the London property market, for example, and in the London property market, you have so much, lots of it's perfectly legitimate, but you've got to question some of the purchases, as happens in the Russia's gold report, of the failing to question some of the purchases, the failure of the UK government to use the Magnitsky rules and powers that it has to the effect it has. And I think that the UK could certainly be doing an awful lot more to support democracy and the rule of law in Russia.
Do you think that that's... Sorry, Brett, go ahead.
I was just going to say, do you think is Putin in trouble at all in this respect? Because we've seen these sort of protests and international response, similar international response to Russia before, whether it be when the war broke out in Ukraine or the fighting in Syria or whatnot. Do you think that he's more in trouble than he was then now?
Oh, it's hard to say. It's always hard to say. I mean, one thing not to forget about Russia is the huge security apparatus that the president has at his disposal. And not only that, you look at other parts of society with the business buy-in, security buy-in, other areas. One thing that struck me when I met Russian parliamentarians was when you met groups, say in a Foreign Affairs Committee has people from different parties. So all of us in, say, the UK Foreign Affairs Committee, we'd have different viewpoints, different takes, we'd debate, discuss, and we'd try and find common ground. It wasn't always easy because you have different views. What struck me in Russia was that everybody seemed to have the same view of very, very controversial issues. So when you don't have that level of dissent and you don't have that level of debate in Parliament, then that debate must take place somewhere else. And it seems to be that Alexei Navalny has tapped into that rich vein of debate, and the Russian state is doing everything it can to prevent people that caused a threat from getting into business, standing for election, having a free media. So when the state's tentacles, if you like, go absolutely everywhere, finances are tied up, the media is tied up in it, politicians are tied up in it. It takes a well-organized and brave group to stand up to that kind of authoritarianism. I think that you're seeing it, and I think because we've seen it across the country, and they're finding ways around on YouTube and the use of social media and innovative ways to campaign. And I fear that it will lead to a backlash by the Russian authorities, and that we take our eye off the ball again. Or what may also happen, as has happened in the past, and we've seen this in Ukraine, Syria, Georgia, is that another war starts off because of domestic problems at home, and especially when the rest of the world is so tied up with response to the pandemic, which is understandable. And also in the UK's made itself increasingly isolated. And not only are we dealing with a pandemic, but we're dealing with the fallout from Brexit and from leaving our closest partners elsewhere in the European Union at a time when Europe actually needs to pull together more than ever before, and the EU could be a much more effective counterweight. And actually historically has been. I mean, if you look at the enlargement, the success of the enlargement in 2004 onwards, and what you've seen in terms of democratization and stability in Eastern Europe, None of that was ever guaranteed.
Yeah.
None of that was guaranteed. And sometimes you overlook where the successes are. And finally, sorry, that's a longer answer. If you look at what's happened in the Baltic states, where you've got three relatively newly independent states, we're talking who have emerged over the past 30 years, which is quite a short period of time in geopolitics, which are successful, respect the rule of law, and crucially in terms of human rights and value of living, have made their citizens' lives better. Because that's what you're in politics to do, is in terms of values and ultimately making your citizens and the citizens elsewhere in the world's lives better. And it's been really interesting watching those three small Baltic states. You know, these are all, I think the largest is Lithuania, about 3.5 million people, make a big impact in Europe, and also leading the way on issues like Belarus and everything that's going on there. So change can come, but it requires an investment from the rest of us.
Yeah, in terms of democratization, then, do you think that those countries are models that Russia can look to, or activists that are in Russia, or opposition politicians that are in Russia can look to, or is Russia such a unique case that really there isn't necessarily a model towards democratization that it can follow?
I think Russia's unique, but then every country's unique. Sure. But let's not forget Russia is vast. Not only is Russia vast, but it's incredibly diverse. It's not Russia, I mean, it's the Russian Federation. Yeah. And if you look at the differences, and sometimes we overlook this, if you look at for example, you go from the predominantly some predominantly Muslim republics down in the south, like Dagestan. Dagestan is about the same size as Wales in terms of population and size, and it's got almost 40 different languages, countless ethnic groups. That's just one republic. Yeah. One republic, down in the Caucasus, and then you've got Chechnya and Ingushetia. And then elsewhere, if you look at the other republics across the Russian Federation, and going way out to the east, where you still have nomadic tribes making a living there. So, and then of course the big population centers of Moscow and Petersburg. So there is always something we can learn from each other. And actually, that's the great thing about bringing people closer together. And the pandemic. There's been many dreadful things about the pandemic. It's been awful, but in some ways geography has been removed. So when we're having this conversation today, it does not matter where in the world the three of us are, is that we're able to have this conversation, and we're getting better at that. Yeah. So there's always, Russia is a unique case. Never forget its size and its distinctiveness. It is a multi-ethnic, large state. But we can always learn from each other, and I think you can learn from what's going on just across the border. And one thing that ordinary Russians will be seeing is that when you have democracy, when you have the rule of law, that leads to a better quality of life and a better standard of life, not just in terms of the economy, but in terms of your human rights being respected, in terms of opportunities for future generations that are coming through. So yes, there is plenty we can learn, but every case is unique. Russia particularly so.
Do you think it's possible for Russia to move towards being more democratic without those areas becoming independent in some way then? Do you think that the reason that Russia has been able to stay together in the form that it has, obviously smaller than it was under the Soviet Union, is because of its sort of strongman rule?
I mean, if you look at most countries on earth, where you get thriving economies, you get democracy. And where economies start to grow and populations grow, you'll find that they start to bump up against that authoritarianism has its limits. I mean, look at the issues that you've got. So let's take the rule of law. If you're the rule of law makes sense in terms of democracy and business. And this is where I think, why shouldn't Russia have the rule of law? It allows its citizens to thrive. If you look at the rule of law, if you're a big business and you want to invest, you want to be protected. The rule of law gives you that protection, that if you have contractual difficulties, which will always happen, that you have a set of independent courts who can arbitrate between those contractual differences. All this pretty dull stuff, but really, really important stuff, actually. And also the other thing that when people talk about wealth and its size, Russia is very unequal. You go outside, you go to parts of Moscow, there's poverty. You go outside Moscow, where it can be very, very underdeveloped. So not everybody is feeling the economic growth. So not only do I think it's possible for somewhere like Russia to have democracy and the rights that the rest of us take for granted, I think it's desirable for its long-term sustainable future. Russia is a European country. It should be a key partner in it. And if you look at the impact that Russia's had, the positive impact, literature, science, learning, that we across the rest of Europe benefit from Russia over the years, you see that it wasn't always like this. Similarly, it goes the other way, and you see the impact that the rest of Europe's had on Russia, including, and this is where I'll give a shout out to my own country, including Scotland, where you see deep relationships between somewhere like Scotland, a country of 5 million on the northwest edge, and somewhere as vast as Russia. You know, the courts of Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, were full of Scots, and that's just Scotland. You know, and there'll be other examples from elsewhere as well. So I think it's important for Russia's future, and it's important for Europe's future as well.
Mm-hmm. I was reading about, I can't remember where, but about the economic impact of the recent sanctions imposed against Russia have had against these sort of communities outside of Moscow specifically, and how that could be an increasing reason for why the protests have become so much bigger recently. Do you think the international community should be being even more strict on Russia? Because it's always seemed to me, at least, that people seem that the different Western countries, at least, seem to be quite reluctant to impose more or very strict sanctions against Russia. What are your views on that?
I think Europe should be pulling together on it. That if you have a pan-European approach, I think that helps. I think that the targeting of individuals who are known to be involved in activities, be it corruption, be it anti-democratic activities, be it attacks on the rule of law, or others. So I think there is a lot more that can be done. I think the stuff, and I'll go back to the issues around the financial markets, and I think we need to take a closer look at some of the property markets around this. And again, what's interesting are some of the findings that we came up to in the report, Russia's Gold in the Foreign Affairs Committee, are still not been implemented, or still hold true. And I would encourage anybody to go and have a look at that. I wish I have a copy sitting over there, but I don't have a copy sitting next to me at the moment. But please go and have a look, and even if you're able to put the link up along with this interview, I think that would be really helpful, because it's a relatively short report. It's very accessible. The great thing about is actually something that I'm very critical of the way Westminster works. I think its committee system works really well. And I'm sure that my colleagues who were on the committee won't mind me saying, one of the great things it works with are some really good experts and officials who do the writing of the reports, who I think do really good writing, simple, accessible. And if you're able to stick up a link with this interview, I'd encourage anybody to go and have a wee look at that.
For sure.
Would you just sort of, I guess, veering off topic a little bit, would you be able to tell us a little bit about the recent involvement, I guess, on the topic of the EU slightly, of your involvement in the eu+me campaign? Because I know this is something that you've been involved in after your parliamentary career.
So the eu+me campaign, which I convene a board across, with members from other political parties, with people from business, the arts, voluntary groups. We've got this broad board, and the aim of eu+me is to campaign to maintain our links with the European Union. We think it was a mistake to leave the European Union. Our closest partners, you cannot avoid geography. You cannot get away from geography. And as Europe moves towards building links and being closer, what we do is, by cutting off our business, we make business less affordable, and actually small businesses in particular being badly hit by that, as we've seen. Shellfish producers, classic example, but others as well. You know, what we're finding is big business is trying to manage because it's got the resource and teams of lawyers. The small businesses who are actually the real engines of the economy, driving innovation and growth, especially outside big cities, are struggling because of this. So eu+me is trying to campaign to maintain those links. And there's a really good campaign, for example, on Erasmus that has training and education opportunities. Because for me, one of the great tragedies of Brexit is that in politics, you should always leave politics with the next generation having more opportunities than you had. And actually, that's not the case now. There are now fewer opportunities for the generation that comes after mine. So it's to campaign for those links, and there's a campaign on Erasmus at the moment to try and maintain that openness.
It sounds really worthwhile, and of course it's something that we've covered extensively on this show and debated often.
So please go and have a look at eu+me, have a look at the website, and get in touch with the team and feed in your thoughts and your own experiences. Because when I was doing a lot of work around Brexit, it always seemed, you're talking about treaties and rules and relationships between governments. The big thing about the EU is it has an impact on everybody's lives, from the price of food and drink, the kind of food and drink you've got on your table, your educational opportunities, your training opportunities, and the freedom to live, work, love anywhere you like in the EU. It's all about bringing down barriers rather than putting them up.
Yeah, for sure. Is the campaign in any way tied to independence movements in Scotland?
No.
Or is it completely...
No, it's not. So really glad I've got colleagues, for example, Jez Killen, who was a Labour MP, Jeremy Purvis, who was a Lib Dem MSP and is a Lib Dem peer, both sit on the board, for example, and there are others. So I'm pro-independence, but some of my colleagues on eu+me are definitely not pro-independence, and that's fine, because it's like anything, we find common ground, and this is an area where there's definitely common ground in Scotland.
For sure. And how can people get involved or find out more if they want to? We'll be sure to put any links, but their social media
Put up the link to the website and to the social media. Go on, drop the team a message if you want to be involved. And tell them about your experiences and how you'd like to be involved. So if you're able to put up the link to the website, the link to the link to the Twitter site, go and like them, and also just follow what they're doing. And they've got some fantastic stuff. And it's not just about Erasmus and education. I noticed recently that one of the things the team were doing around musicians is a fantastic tradition of live musicians from Scotland and elsewhere going out around Europe. So you can listen to Scottish traditional music pretty much anywhere in Europe, see it live. I remember going to watch some of it, and that comes to an end. So there was a really good campaign about opening up music and having that freedom of movement for musicians. So it's all about maintaining those ties where we possibly can. So please go and have a look and drop us your own thoughts. If people have got thoughts about areas for campaigning, if they've got areas where they think, oh, you haven't thought about this because it's such a big thing, Brexit, then please drop a line and share your thoughts and your own experiences.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Stephen. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Great to join you.
Thanks.